So welcome, Landrum, to the Keen Yoga podcast. It's been a while trying to get you here, so I'm pleased we finally arrived at getting on the Keen Yoga podcast. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Adam. I'm happy to talk to you.
Yeah, we had a few glitches with internets and timings, but now we've got Ty. We've finally captured him, pinned him down. We're ready to grill him. So, not really. So, yeah, I mean, let's start at the obvious place. I always start really here with just like, do you want to just, I know you've told this story many times before, but you just want to tell again briefly about your background and how you've started yoga, how you got into it,
Sure. I'll give you a really short version.
Yeah, we'll still stop talk. Yeah.
I started yoga, I was 30. So it was about 17 years ago. And I had just moved to the East Coast to go to graduate school. And I started the same right at that time. And I did not think that yoga was terribly interesting when I started.
That's funny. That's funny. So you didn't have that kind of coming home moment. Everyone says, "Oh, the first time I stepped in the door, I felt like I was at home." You didn't feel that.
Well, not when I stepped in the door, but by the time I walked out of the door after that first class, I was taken. Yeah. But I mean, my impression of yoga was that it really had nothing to do with me. I thought it kind of a little bit absurd, to tell you the truth. And, I kind of associated it with, I don't know, cultural appropriation and kind of superficial spirituality and so on and so forth. But a friend of mine encouraged me to go. And I was struggling with depression at that time, as many people who stay in academia for as long as I did do. He told me that it could help. And I was ready to, try.
Yeah, when you're in that place, you're
yoga.
Yeah.
And it took years, but it worked. Yeah.
Okay.
It cured me even of that terrible malady.
Right.
Yeah.
So you were really quite suffering then, were you, at the time? When you
I was for a very long time.
Right. No, that didn't go away straight away. It took a number of years of practice, did it?
Yes, it did. And it was kind of a gradual shift out. And one thing that was really interesting to me was that almost immediately I understood that it would help, because it revealed to me, almost by the first day, what the kind of emotional source of that depression was. And it helped me, and I could feel it viscerally on my body. And I understood that I could, that gave me a whole different way to relate to it. And yoga was presented to me from the first day as an invitation to relate to it viscerally and openly and intelligently. And so it was an epiphany. It really was.
Right.
Yeah.
I always ask, and people always think I'm, just being contrary here, but why do you think that, of difficult, but why do you think that was that yoga did that? And I always wonder why yoga would be talked of in these kind of terms, or almost sound kind of rather poetic, and so, exactly what you're talking about at the start, right? Like why not football or, martial arts, what do you think that made you allowed you to locate? Because I had the same experience, but I'm always questioning why that was, that the emotional source seemed to present itself and allow some kind of reconciliation in the way that other modalities that I'd always also done. I was doing gym at the time, because I was also, as you might know, suffering from depression. That's why I got into it. And also a philosophy student, so very scathing really towards some kind of this kind of thing. So, it was a last ditch attempt, anything, I'll try anything,
Yeah.
And I was surprised because I was doing all other things that didn't seem to be working that well, really, and then immediately I did that yoga class. I still to this day don't really understand why that works.
Yeah. I mean, I think my sense of it, was and remains that it has something to do with the kind of awareness that you're bringing to the body. And for me, it was, I mean, the source of the depression was unprocessed grief. And on that first day, I felt my unprocessed grief like like it felt like I had a cinder block lodged in my chest. And I realized that I feel that way all the time.
Right.
But there was something about the way that, the way that we're breathing in yoga and the kind of awareness that we're bringing to the breath, and that, it opened a door that had been closed for so long, which was a kind of door that kept me from that kept my awareness from dropping into that place.
Yeah.
Even if there were other levels of the body that I was quite aware of. I was really into climbing before that. Right. And, I would, just tromping through it, the North American wilderness was kind of my palliative, for many, many years. It's the thing that gave me respite from it all. The silence and the exertion and solitude. And yet none of that ever, had the same impact. It didn't reveal the source of the thing to me in the way that the yoga did. So I think it's about awareness.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, it's not like we don't have ideas, but it's just kind of intriguing as to why that, that it works so well. I mean, it sounds crazy having, both of us, well, me talking about it and having talked for so many years, but still try to kind of understand how and why it works as a modality so well. But on a lighter note, were you good from the first day? Were you good at the postures? Because obviously everyone knows that you've got a very impressive and great ability with the asanas, right? I may say, I don't know about your psychological yogic state, but at least we know with the asanas you've got ability there, undisputably. But you started really late. I mean, I started under 20 and I've never reached your level of ability. So would you just step into the class and start floating around?
No, not at all.
No,
I was really stiff. I really was quite stiff. I saw my first teacher just about a year ago. I don't get to see her every year, but I saw her about a year ago. And she confirmed, I had to ask her again because I was like, because my wife didn't believe me, she was like, no, you must have. No, but that's not to deny that, maybe I have some natural ability or genetic disposition for it or something like that. I think.
How long did it take you to feel like, that you was kind of limbered up and to be able to do a good primary series and, and the things that people, know you for, the lifting up?
It took it took a few years. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, it probably wasn't in until I was into my sort of third year of fully committed practice that I had any sort of inclination that I was kind of above average in my very small yoga community in Virginia. Yeah,
that's a good way to put it. Yeah, and you're right. Who was your first teacher? I'm sure people would like to know that, who your first teacher was.
Yeah, my first teacher, her name is Jennifer Elliott, and she ran Ashtanga Yoga of Charlottesville, which is now run by a friend of mine because she's kind of retired in a way.
Okay.
She was a student of both Richard Freeman and Tim Miller. A long time sort of student of, she would make frequent trips to Mysore, studied with Pattabhi Jois, Sharat and Saraswati all.
Shout out to Jennifer there.
Yeah.
She was really the catalyst to
she was really a fantastic teacher, for many reasons. But the thing that really I think I am most grateful for, apart from the sort of model of like passion and dedication and like the depth of experience that she shared, is she really held space, for me and my super messy, my super messy process. It was an emotionally messy process, even to go through. Yeah, I mean, it's sometimes said it's become quite fashionable as of late, to say that we shouldn't push ourselves in yoga. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It should be very soft, and
Yeah.
that all the aggression should be taken out of it. But I confess that that first 5 or 6 years was really, a lot of sort of wrestling down the demons.
Yeah.
I mean, it
And
was.
I think it's and I think it's good to hear you say that, because I think it's important, as much as I've definitely been a culprit of saying like, don't push, but I've also said, what, if someone had told me that in the early years, I would have told them to F off, and it had to happen that way, in a way, like, because there's stuff that needs to come out. And I mean, I think I still believe that the instruction I got from John Scott about just practice how you feel, there was a lot in that, because before that I was trying to be calm. I was trying to be calm and I didn't feel it. And when I had the kind of liberty to practice how I actually felt, I kind of wore myself out, and I did become more peaceful after just going kind of crazy in the first 20 minutes or so, I suppose. Yeah.
No, I think that's profound advice, like deceptively simple to, practice how you feel. Because like, insofar as you're trying to, make your mind conform to a certain, I don't know, to a certain principle, or to a certain, to bring a certain emotional ambience into your mind, it's just that's just a huge distraction from the yoga, from just letting that awareness really seep in and just being present with whatever's arising. And that's as simple as it sounds.
Well, it's quite Buddhist, really, isn't it? It's kind of peripheral awareness, just allowing, kind of awareness to take in everything rather than excluding awareness, kind of actually, in a way, just expanding awareness to include everything, rather.
That's right. Yeah. Because that's the real solvent, I think, for those, that's the thing that kind of liberates those demons from the prisons of our mind and lets them, show themselves as something else. And so, for certain people at certain times, that process is not pretty. It's not soft. It's not elegant. And that's okay, because just as you said, I think that at that time, if someone had insisted that I sort of, feign calmness and contentment, it just wouldn't, it wouldn't have taken. I wouldn't have stuck around. Yeah.
I was going to ask you something, actually. Did you practice immediately from the first day, or did it take a while to develop a kind of discipline to a daily practice? How did that journey go for you?
I got into it really quickly. That is, I got into the full Mysore program really quickly. It took a few weeks, but that was all.
And then you got into the kind of habit of daily practice, and that kind of took to that kind of naturally, did you?
Yeah. At first, I was just going on Tuesdays and Thursdays to an afternoon class. And I mean, I could barely lift my arms above my head after classes. I was so sore.
Yeah, absolutely.
It was so painful that I couldn't imagine doing it 6 days a week.
Yeah.
But then actually, so David Garrigues came and taught a workshop. I maybe 2 months into it for me. And he taught a weekend intensive, and I had a certain experience there that just really completely ignited the fire. And that Monday I began, the full Mysore curriculum. And
he's definitely I can understand. He's an inspiring character. I can understand. If I'd come across him in my early days, I would have been pretty converted, I'm sure. Yeah. But I remember getting mad when someone said, "Oh, practice in the morning. You should do this. This is a Mysore practice, not with the lead classes. You do them in the evening, whatever, right?" And then, come to the Mysore. It's early. It's like 6. And it's like, I just got angry. I was like, "There's no way I'm going to try and get up and move like that. It's so hard anyway to do it first. What do you trying to suggest? Kill myself here?" And it's like just craziness for me. I wanted to go back to talk a little bit later in your Buddhist connection with the whole thing, but I suppose as a precursor to that, the famous famous yogi Buddhist scholar Richard Freeman I was going to ask how it was, when you met Richard, because obviously he's been a huge influence in your teaching, and Mary, obviously, when you met them, and how that transpired, that you started working with them, and how was it to work with them? Anything on that, that would be very interesting to people, I'm sure.
Yeah, so I didn't meet Richard until 2012, so about 10 years ago. And I had wanted to meet him for some time because, during that first year that I started doing Mysore, I watched those old Yoga Works videos and saw him, in that group doing third series. And I was just like, wow, I just remember thinking, I want whatever he's feeling while he's doing that. I want to feel that. Like, I want to feel that consciousness and that energy that he's experiencing. And it was him in particular. I didn't even know his name. I didn't even know who that was. And I went and asked my teacher. She said, oh yeah, that's Richard. And I knew that she'd studied with him. So I was interested in meeting him for a long time. So I went to Boulder in 2012 and took their month-long intensive. And I had just finished graduate school. I was in a postdoc year, and I didn't want to continue in academia because for me, it became clear in time that it was quite a toxic environment. It's extremely competitive, and I honestly, I didn't like the way that the analytic philosophy was impacting my ordinary thinking patterns.
Yeah.
So it began to feel it began to feel very oppressive, and
and also, you didn't. From my experience, because I come from a similar background, I didn't do the PhD. I got out earlier than that. Or yoga kind of.
You had more sense
grabbed me. Well, I just had to encounter yoga, so it was an escape route, maybe at a slightly earlier date. If you get into academic philosophy for Socratic reasons, let's say, you get sooner or later pretty depressed. About where it's going, and for me, it was like the proof wasn't in the pudding. Like, I didn't see these guys that were my mentors, and the academic kind of giants that I had looked up to. When I got to know them better, I didn't see them as particularly embodied. I didn't see them as happy. I didn't see them as living decent lives either. A lot of the things that I was starting to discover weren't that impressive to me, about their lives and the way that they were living them. So, I just kind of felt, well, like, if you get into it for that reason, not just simply to do a career, it's pretty disheartening. And I know that you spoke on another podcast, maybe it was Scott's, about how you felt about the, your other kind of disembodied kind of philosophy peers.
Yes. Yeah. I had quite similar experiences. And, by contrast, many of the people that I knew in yoga were sane, believe it or not. They just seemed, much more, healthy in mind, body, and spirit. And so, I just felt healthier and more alive in that world. And I had indeed, come into yoga for, as you put it, Socratic reasons. That is, into philosophy. Wanting to, seeking, wanting to understand something. I didn't go into it at all because I saw it as a career or anything. I was just following, my kind of intellectual passions, following the questions, and ended up there. And, but the whatever I was looking for, I was drawing much closer to it, or relating to it more richly in yoga than in academic philosophy. And I was really careful not to approach yoga philosophy with the same kind of academic mind.
Rigor.
because I was really keenly aware of the way that sort of analytic approach could suck the life out of any theme that it got its hands on. You know, because I was writing about human development and love in philosophy, and I have no regrets about it. It was a very enriching time. It's just that I'd come to the point where it was just not, you know, I understood it. I had sort of taken from it the enrichment that I was there to take, and that it was kind of time to move on. But relating to these things in a more embodied way, you know, to having a sort of more, to me, that seeking switched from being so intellectual and analytic to being more embodied, being more heart-centric. And that was, that was a profound, wonderful kind of shift. So
I think to bring it around to Richard again, because I realized that I've derailed the conversation as usual. I mean, how does that, you know, if we try and segue this in, how did he help to kind of contextualize the asana part of what you were doing? Because I kind of recognized in myself, it was many years before I brought the philosophy back to the asana. I just kind of felt the asana kind of worked. I didn't really know why. And I didn't really actually pursue any of the yoga philosophy around it whatsoever, funnily enough. You know, I kept reading, you know, the existential stuff that I liked, that, you know, and the two things were separate.
I see. Yeah. Well, I mean, for one thing, I mean, let me answer a slightly different question about Richard before I say how did he contextualize it. I'll just
I was just trying to bring it back.
When I went to Boulder and I took that intensive, and I heard Richard give, you know, his philosophical talks, I was so inspired by the sort of openness, this intellectual suppleness of his mind, and the kind of syncretism of his thinking, which is, you know, as you know, in academic philosophy, there's a tendency to draw to always point out how this is different from that, how this, you know, to draw distinctions between different things. And, you know, you can almost get the sense that then in different, for example, yogic or spiritual traditions, as if, you know, the various kinds of experiences that people are writing about, you know, say in Buddhism, as opposed to classical yoga, have almost nothing to do with each other. You know, it can you know, an academic can make it sound that way. And I just remember one of the first things that Richard was talking about was on the apparent difference between the, you know, that if you'll forgive the term, the classical Hindu notion of the self as the goal of yoga, and the Buddhist notion of sort of no self as the goal of yoga, right? So there's a sort of obvious grammatical, you know, difference there. They seem antagonistic on the face of it, right? Like as if you have to decide whether metaphysically you come down on the side of self or no self before you can go on to practice. And I remember Richard talking about this and basically, you know, saying with sort of breathtaking clarity that these were just two different ways of talking about the same experience, just two different ways that language can approach a similar kind of, you know, awakened state. And I just thought it was so first rate, you know.
I think people often ask that question: Can I study Buddhism whilst practicing yoga? I mean, on a deeper level, as you get further into it, I mean, I think you've pursued Buddhism further as well, and I know Richard has, and people often say, well, you know, he's essentially a kind of closet Buddhist, right? You know, as if it's a kind of, you know, slanderous thing to be in terms of a yoga practitioner. Do you think? Well, I don't know. You know, making a meal out of that. But what do you think? And, you know, as you get deeper into it, can you be a Buddhist and practice yoga asana, or the two ultimately the two viewpoints at loggerheads? at any point down the line?
I mean, I think absolutely. Of course you can. I think yeah, I think absolutely. I think there are no, there's no interesting conflicts there at all. Yeah. And of course, even the hatha yoga tradition and even the classical tradition of Patanjali seems to be sort of cross-pollinated with various
there's loads of Buddhism in there, isn't there?
Yeah.
I was thinking that Buddhism is just the kind of psychological part of yoga. They just do the psychology really well, the mind states and how to combat negative mind states, and how to, when you feel this, do that. And, it's just much more practical and applicable in lots of ways than the kind of transcendental yoga stuff, which is kind of way out there, So it's easy to get into in lots of ways. I probably would kind of recommend, if on second thinking, if people are interested in yoga philosophy, you might kind of actually give them some Buddhist stuff first of all. Actually might be a sensible idea. Yeah, it's more kind of easily approachable, isn't it? But before I go off further, what about how did Richard and Mary's idea about the alignment in the asana? Because obviously they're very specific and very skillful about how to teach the asana itself. How did that rub off on you? How did you absorb that into your own way of teaching?
I found it immediately exciting. I mean, I found, in my own studies, I was sort of drawn to understanding the energetics of the asanas. So understanding the way that the different asanas sort of impact the pranas, and what kind of psychological impacts that can have. And so I was like that. I mean, I was doing my own sort of personal and, not just experiential, but also, in my reading, I was researching that as much as I could. And then when I came to Boulder and heard Mary and Richard talking about their sort of alignment-based approach is based on, prana and apana. And so I found that, really exciting. And he helped bring a new clarity for me to that subject. So yeah, and of course they also sort of teach that subject in such a way that the alignment between prana and apana also has a sort of profound psychological impact that can help sort of draw the mind into a more open, more lucid state. So
how is that different to structural alignment then?
Well, I think that I'm not sure exactly what you mean by structural alignment, but maybe you mean something that's a bit more physiologically oriented.
Yes, exactly.
Like one approach
the
to
hip bone should rotate this way in order, because that's how the joint works. And
one kind of one kind of approach to alignment has to do with physiology, has to do with anatomy, has to do with functional movement.
Exactly.
And that's all wonderful also, but it's not it's different, from an energetic based approach. Yeah. What's really, I was going to say one thing that's pretty fascinating about it though, is that the sort of energetic based approach seems to, let's say, not to overuse the term, but align very well with the physiological approach. I mean, you arrive at many of the same kind of conclusions, about how it makes sense to move. But well, at least at one, if you're zoomed in really closely, if you're talking about like how to sort of hold, how to hold a particular posture, but the approach that we take, the approach I've studied with Mary and Richard and continue to explore, involves, moving very dynamically with the breath, right? And and we find that the breath has a very kind of wave-like motion as it moves through the body, and that as it cycles and circulates, then the body kind of undulates with the breath. And that's true not just in the vinyasa that take you from one posture to another, when you're
in the
holding a
postures,
particular
in the posture
posture.
itself. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. And so there, I mean, I don't see the sort of anatomical, the structural alignment approach ever addressing like how to move with the breath while you're in a posture or from posture to posture. But to me, the real potency of a practice like Ashtanga Vinyasa or any other kind of Vinyasa Krama style, it really depends on that. I mean, to me, that's where the real sweetness and the real potency of it is.
You can indisputably see it in your practice and Richard's, and the sense of wave-like undulation is really kind of mesmerizing to watch. How would you frame, practically speaking, if we could give a slightly further and more concrete kind of explanation of how the breath implicates the posture? And are we talking about the diaphragm here, or what's the relationship of the diaphragm to the bandhas? Could you maybe say something a little bit more to flesh this out for people speaking? How you mean the breath? Yeah,
gladly. So like the inhale exemplifies a kind of expansive pattern that has its seed point at the center of the heart, which is the center of prana. And so when the prana pattern predominates, there's this sense of lifting and spreading, and especially the front of the body spreads and lifts. I mean, like physiologically, right? As the diaphragm presses down, the rib cage goes up and the front of it expands.
Yeah.
Right? The shadow side of that is that you kind of close down on the back of the diaphragm and on the zone of the kidneys, where your kind of deep chi or your deep storehouse of prana is. Now, with the exhale pattern, the back of the body tends to expand. And there's a sense of grounding, of dropping, of contracting, especially toward the pelvis. And so a seed point of apana, the dissolving energy, is there in the pelvis. And that pattern is expressed by that spreading of the back of the body. But the shadow side of that is closing down on the heart. So you see how even I'm talking about it, and my collarbones are rolling forward, my shoulders draw in, the head kind of cuts down, and there's it's like this posture as opposed to this one, right? Which has a kind of upward, outward, expansive kind of movement to it.
Yeah.
So, when we're breathing, we're sort of oscillating back and forward between those two patterns naturally, rhythmically. Everything breathes, everything's continuously either taking something in, and that's traditionally the work of prana, or releasing something out, and that's the work of the apana. And there's that kind of continual exchange with the environment. And so the mind is also doing the same thing. Like our thoughts are kind of branching and spreading out. And then, the attention selects one of the different possible things that I might think, and sort of lets everything else dissolve. And that's the aponic force. And then the thought that I'm holding on to starts to branch, and I follow the thread there, and then the rest dissolves. And so, even in thought, that sort of prana apana pattern is continuously oscillating, going back and forth. And so the basic idea in hatha yoga is to work with these opposing forces and to bring them into balance. And because when they're in balance, it's the awareness. Well, let's just say when those things come into balance, it shifts your mode of awareness in a very easily recognizable kind of way. So the idea is to keep both of these patterns active simultaneously, right? So that the dissolving force is continuously active. And so space is being continuously made for something new to appear. That is, for the pranic force to come in, for the inhale to come in, right? And so how do you stay connected to the aponic energy as you're allowing the inhale to expand? How do you stay connected to the pelvis as you allow the inhale to expand? And that, so that kind of undulating actions come from, using Mula Uddiyana Bandha to lift that aponic energy from the pelvis up toward the heart, so that there's more space for the heart to expand. And what you find, sort of astonishingly, because it sounds somewhat theoretical, philosophical, sophisticated or something, but it's as simple to start to explore the truth of it. You can simply, while you're just sitting and breathing, you can kind of drop your tailbone a little bit down into the earth and drop the sitting bones and gently pull back and up underneath the belly. So that's all like stimulating the aponic force and lifting it up. And you find that when you do that, your inhale's more full than it otherwise would be. Or if you're in
are you doing it in daily life as well? Sorry to interrupt. Are you doing,
yeah,
you mentioned that the breath is doing it anyway. So it was coming up as a question to you, like, how is the yoga thing just kind of accentuating what's already happening, or bringing further awareness into a pattern that's kind of the breathing is happening anyway, or
yeah. Yeah, I think, well, but so ordinarily it's like our attention is either like, we're either sort of grasping at something or pushing something away, so our attention is like throwing itself toward the pranic movement or throwing itself toward the aponic movement. Right. And the state of the sort of yogic technique of bringing these two energies into balance, it serves to bring you into a state where you're kind of letting things go, like even like just letting your thoughts go as soon as they're arising, right? Which doesn't mean you're like trying to shut them off or trying to put them down, but just like holding space open to admire the sort of blossoming pattern of prana psychologically. And this is, that same state is what's represented by the image of Patanjali that's described like in the second verse of the Ashtanga invocation. You have this image of Patanjali in that verse where Patanjali he's an amalgam of serpent and human forms. He's got a serpent's tail from the waist down, and he's got a serpent's hood that comes up, from, I always imagine it's probably from the back of the diaphragm and rises up above the head. And then that serpent's hood is itself made up of 1,000 other serpent's heads. And they're traditionally said to be all singing in different languages. And because they represent prana, they represent the diversity of different perspectives that you could take on any moment of experience. And Patanjali in this image, when you see especially visual or three-dimensional, representations, what's human about him, his human head and his human heart and and also his like pelvis are sort of floating in the middle between these two serpent elements, and they represent prana and apana. And he's in a kind of meditative state, right? Like his eyes are closed, but he's obviously not sleeping. He's got the subtle smile on his face. He's meditating. And he's listening to all of those singing serpent heads without allowing any one of them to distract him out of the present moment. Like he's listening to them all simultaneously. And what's allowing him to do that is the fact that like his attention's not seizing on any one of them, which is what we're always doing. You go, oh, that's what I think. Oh, this is what I feel. Oh, this is what I'm worried about. Oh, this is what but instead it's just this psychical energy is just blooming. And what's allowing him to just attend to all of it without having to like locate himself in psychical space, define himself with respect to it, is that coiled serpent's tail that's connecting him to the earth, which is to say like apana, which is like, well, that's just good bandha, right? So it's just keeping the aponic force continuously active so that there's like a continuous clearing of space, a continuous opening and so then if you want to understand it kind of in more almost psychoanalytic terms or psychotherapeutic terms, it's like, the space of our sort of surface level consciousness is being kept open for anything from the underworld, from the world of well, from the world of Anantashesha, from the world of the unconscious, any psychic material that wants to reveal itself to the light of our awareness is being invited in. It's allowed to be there, and it's allowed to kind of move in and just show itself, which is the way that the psychical energy that's behind it is released. But it won't show itself and it won't release until we stop pushing against it, until we stop trying to repress it, trying to put it down, trying to hold it below the surface.
How does the physical posture relate or facilitate to that?
Yeah, I think in the following way, that when we're going through all these different postures, we are inviting the prana to circulate through our bodies in different ways, And there's this old idea that wherever the prana goes, the chitta goes. It's an old Upanishadic idea that prana and chitta follow each other. Sometimes it's said like two birds flying in formation. So it's like so when the prana starts to move in the body in sort of unfamiliar ways, it sort of, and again, this is metaphorical talk, of course, but there's no other way to talk, right? That it kind of dredges up the sediment of unprocessed experience. We all know that. I mean, when you go to practice yoga, it's this, if you really pay attention to your experience, it's like between just lifting your arms above your head and taking a deep breath and folding down into, the second position, you can have all kinds of sort of flashes of old memory, different tastes in your mouth. You smell different things. It's like the sensation, the body just sort of teems with sensation in practicing yoga. And the sensation is like decontextualized, right? Like when you're practicing yoga, you remember all kinds of stuff that you wouldn't otherwise remember. You don't, you don't normally, if you're kind of just engaged in a task or like focused on something, it's not that quite that same experience. But you start breathing really deeply and rhythmically through the body, and all of a sudden you become so aware of what it is that you're feeling, so aware of what's really on your mind. And it sort of starts dredging deeper and deeper. You start becoming aware of things that weren't really on your mind, but that, are sort of things that you're suppressing, different sort of tangles of old energy, of memory, of thought, of emotion that you've been sort of holding down beneath the surface. And you start to feel those things. And then if you let those things into the space of your awareness, then the energy that you were using to suppress those things, and also the energy that's tangled up inside them, starts to release. And that's profoundly cathartic. Yeah.
I mean, talking like this, it doesn't seem that you ostensibly would need the sequences of Batavi Joyce. That what makes you continue practicing those set sequences rather than just go along with this awareness and follow the prana and apana through any posture that you choose.
Well,
these sequences that they're so obviously have their own foibles and flaws to any thinking mind, right? Yet we stick with them anyway.
Well, I mean, and for the past, I don't know, 4 years or so, I've veered more and more away from following those set sequences and more toward just sort of following the intelligence of my own breath.
Right.
But it served me so well to practice those sequences for as long as I did, because it kind of revealed, it's like learning your scales as a musician or something. And also because it sort of showed me, it sort of showed me the intelligence of the basic patterns that those sequences follow, which kind of reiterates the same pattern that we were just talking about, of the apana being lifted up, that I mean, let me say it simply, and then if you're interested, I can go, we can, talk at some level of complication about it. But, there's a basic energetic movement in Hatha yoga, right? And it goes from low to high, at least first, right? At first, it goes from low to high. There's a sense of kind of, the process of Hatha yoga is traditionally, there's many, many accounts of it, right? But the account that's mostly captured the modern imagination goes something like this: that when prana and apana come into balance, especially so in the pelvis or in the belly or something, it's sort of it sends a surge of creative force through the body. And when that force surges, it sort of moves through different psychical centers and kind of untangles the psychical energy that's pent up at these different levels of experience, with all the different emotions that attend those. So there's a kind of cathartic release that goes with this surging, and the surging goes from low to high, right? And that if it goes high enough, that it goes through the throat and then all the way into the head, and draws the practitioner into certain kind of exalted states of consciousness, right? Which then precipitate in the downpouring of the lunar rain, right? Of the nectar of yoga, the soma, the amrita, right? So Hatha yoga has both this movement of transcendence, which is the surging of creative energy, and the descent of grace, and the sort of reintegration of that experience into embodiment. But practice, in the mode of practice, it's very much about reiterating. It's very much about reiterating that pattern, and that same pattern. It's an archetypal pattern. I mean, you can hear the way that you find that pattern in any religious tradition. The moment of there's the aspiration of the spirit, the lifting, the raising, the aspiration toward the heavens, and then the sort of divine intimation, and perhaps even the sort of descent, and that same pattern is reiterated through the 5 pranas on the breath. So when prana and apana come into balance, it stimulates samana vayu, which is a kind of equalizing, balancing vayu of, when prana and apana are both, when the creative force of prana is allowed to spread itself out and then dissolve just as soon as it's arising. It's like the mind never gets tangled up in anything that it's thinking. And so then if that energy is allowed to move all the way up, because it's said that the psychical energy, it rises, and we experience it like around the head. We experience thought as being in our head, although thought doesn't actually have any physical location, right? I mean, it doesn't have physical dimensionality. You're listening to what I'm, how long is the thought that I'm thinking right now? Is it 6 centimeters, or is it, it's just, but we experience it sort of here, around the head. That's where we think. We point to our heads. In cartoons, if you want to know who's thinking what, you read the thing by their head. It's just the way that we sort of experience that. But the idea is that, let's say, if through another important bandha, which is the releasing of the soft palate, Jalandhara bandha, those currents are allowed to go all the way through, and then they crest at the Dwadashanta, which is the top of that serpent's hood, and then they move back toward the center of the heart. And that's what the kind of curling motion of that serpent's hood represents. And that is just the returning of the energy that's held within any particular thought form back into the subtle body, or back into the heart. And it's kind of a somewhat esoteric sounding way of describing something that's totally familiar, which is that if you let go, when you let go of something that you're like, say you're pissed at somebody, or you're worried about something, you're holding on to something, and then somehow you just let it go. Like, especially if you forgive somebody, and there's a huge weight lifted from your shoulders. if you really have forgiveness, in your heart, like, because it's so much work, to carry around all the weight of that resentment, or the weight of grief, as I know too well. And that when you finally let that go, and if the soft palate's released, it's like that upward energy isn't contracted and caught and held in the form of a particular thought, but it's just allowed to move through the space of consciousness and then flow back down. And that energy, then returns to the heart and is reabsorbed in a process that's called hatapeka, which means like sudden reabsorption of energy. And I take
I know
it
my next question is going to disappoint you, but I'm conscious we're running out of time, and I know people will be thinking, well, how does this actually practically apply to what he's teaching now? So I suppose I would just, if you don't mind me getting in there and slightly kind of derailing what is a very interesting topic. I mean, I know people will be thinking, well, what is he actually going to teach me now if I come and see Ty? If he's not teaching the sequences exactly, and he's teaching me this kind of serpent movement over the crown of the head and then back into the heart, how does that manifest in what I'm actually going to learn on an asana level, on a practical level?
So I take it that we are in asana practices and in pranayama practices, we are participating in that same pattern. We're reiterating it in each breath. So the way that we hold it, the way that we use the bandhas, the way that we allow the spine to undulate in any given posture, and the way that we keep the soft palate released and hold the head, so that there can be this kind of turning, this kind of cycling of energy on a very fine-grained level, on a very fine-grained physiological level. We are honing that very same pattern. So for example, in rolling from chaturanga to upward facing dog, that kind of undulating pattern that some people exhibit, and then the exact way that you lift your head, the exact moment when it comes up, and the way you hold the muscles of the face and the jaw as you do all that, it makes a profound difference to your mental state over time, and to the suppleness of the body, to the way that, because it's like, it's one thing just to go through the motions, but you can do it so rigidly, and unfortunately, Ashtangis, for all the other virtues of their practice, are, I think compared to other yogis, we tend to kind of clench a bit. We hold things pretty hard. I mean,
so
our
essentially,
practice
you're still teaching the Ashtanga sequences.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
More or less. Yes. Just to clarify.
Oh yes.
Okay.
No, I think the sequences are amazing. I still teach them. It's just in my own practice, I allow myself to
some variation there.
I allow myself quite a lot of variation, and I found that has been really that's been really exhilarating. It's been super inspiring. It's been super interesting for me. Because though that same movement from low to high is one of the things I was trying to say, was that is exhibited in these sequences, that you start on your feet, you start with your connection to the earth. You always start stimulating the apana, and then you sink low, like doing lots of lunging and, the standing postures, right? To really like draw that earth energy up into the lower body and stimulate it. And then you start doing deeper hip opening things and going more and more aponic. And all of the first 4 Ashtanga series, I'll go like that, right? And then you kind of lift the energy higher and then start spreading it out more, right? So then you kind of lift it up more to the heart, more shoulder opening, and then postures that are more expansive, where the gaze is up, you're lifting, you're spreading, you're opening, and then you do closing back bends, and then you end with what's essentially just a shoulder standing sequence that really stimulates the throat chakra, and then finally on your head with the final headstand, and lie down. So there's this energetic movement from low to high, that is, just another instantiation of that, basic energetic movement of a full hatha yoga breath, which always, starts from the pelvis and lifts up and goes through the heart and through the soft palate, curls, at the Dwadashanta, and then moves back in toward the heart and dissolves back into emptiness. And it's like, so every breath, but also every well-designed vinyasa sequence exhibits that same pattern. And it's profoundly potent. It really,
what's your, I mean, I'm kind of intrigued. What's your relationship with Mysore, the Mysore Ashtanga in inverted commas tradition then, given this, it's like, can we call it Friedmanian kind of take on it, which is so subtle and so interesting. And then, you went to Mysore for many years, and, you followed the set of sequences, you've got your authorization, you towed, some degree, form or fashion, a kind of party line there. I'm kind of interested to hear anything you might say on your relationship with that, in comparison to the kind of hatha yoga tradition that you're talking about embodying here, which, I totally agree with. Yeah.
Well, I mean, here's the way that it was always taught to me, is that Ashtanga yoga is completely part of that hatha tradition, that it grows out of it, that if you want to understand the deeper intelligence of the Ashtanga system, you understand the hatha tradition, because that's the kind of yoga that it is. It's a breath-based, it is the breath-based asana practice par excellence, right? It's the one that it's the real kind of paragon of vinyasa krama styles. But there's so many possibilities within that krama system. I mean, really using that method. And, it's just, I mean, with Ashtanga convention, I mean, that's just, I don't know, it's far less interesting, but, of course, for all kinds of pragmatic and sociological reasons, that our like relationship to that intelligence can, I don't know, it kind of ebbs and flows. Like, we kind of can like lose sight of it sometimes.
Yeah.
Different ways, or like
slightly qualify the question more, because I know you can say something interesting about this, is how might it be useful in terms of somehow contextualizing this, which could become very, very out there, as it were. Right? Is there anything helpful that you can see in, let's call it, some kind of institutionalization that we find in Mysore, and with the teaching, kind of structure, let's say, to somewhat protecting something, or is it counterproductive at some points?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I mean, I think it's a tough question, honestly. I think, I think, and, not just because I'm worried about saying the wrong thing or hurting somebody's feelings, but I mean, really, I kind of think that, I mean, look, I've always been a bit on the sort of margins, on the outside, a little bit. I mean, I'm actually not authorized. I never did. I just didn't go down that line. I didn't want to get into that, because to me, it felt a little confining. I wasn't ready to sincerely agree to sort of following the rules.
I didn't realize that.
And doing this and that. Okay. So, even though I, have been to Mysore, I haven't been in a while. Maybe I'll go back sometime. I don't know. But I have a kind of a qualified relationship to it. I mean, the conventional way of doing things, like every convention anywhere, is maybe a little less intelligent than it could be, because convention doesn't necessarily track intelligence, it tracks habit, Now, is there some good to sort of having, a certain system that's codified and sort of rigidified in a certain group of, like, absolutely, absolutely. It gives me a reference point. Gives other people a reference point, that, because like, oh my God, like how much work would it be where if every time a student came to you, you had to like teach them sequencing from the very beginning, I mean, that would be ideal. That would be ideal, because then you could give individualized sequences to every student, but even just to do that, you'd have to watch them practice for a while. You have to like really work with someone, right? For weeks, months, so you really get some sequences going that are serving them. And then you have to keep adapting those sequences if you really, really wanted to serve them well. And you
logistically, it's just not feasible. I mean, a lot of it
right.
Logistics, doesn't it? We just can't work that way. The person can't come see us every day and can't, and we can afford, if we're going to, have a livelihood off it, to be able to spend that much time with just one person at a time.
That's it. And then if you're like Sharad and you've got hundreds of people coming to you, I mean, what else can you do? But have some super simple, clear conventions and just make sure that everybody follows it.
Yeah. What's your feeling about a teacher then? What do they mean to you? What's the position, the role of a teacher, and what would you suggest makes a good teacher?
Ooh, yeah. Well, I think what makes a good teacher is someone who's a really good listener, like someone who's really receptive to the whole situation of the student. Because here's the dark side of Ashtanga and of like having a conventional practice that's, is that we slip too easily into the idea that yoga is about making ourselves conform to a certain pattern, right? Which is absurd, right? I mean, if anything, yoga is about unraveling our desire to conform to a certain pattern, right? Like getting inside of that and feeling like, well, why am I so worried about measuring up and being accepted and belonging, to this group and so on and so forth. And yet, most of the focus, especially for younger practitioners, is like, how do I get better and better at doing this? Right? Whereas getting better and better by conventional standards at doing that has not so much to do with yoga, right? And may not necessarily, energetically, what is that going to do for you? And at what level are you even exploring yourself while you're doing that? There may be very little receptivity. So like, it seems to me that the very heart of yoga is like, for us, is learning to be more receptive to our own vital energies, to our bodies. Like our minds want to purge themselves of excess psychic material. They want to do that. And that's an old point, right? Jungian philosophy has its way of putting that point. Buddhist philosophy has a way of putting that point. Patanjali's Yoga Sutras has a way of putting that point, that the mind wants to, it wants to be liberated. It wants to be free of, what's weighing it down. And it will do that if we give it space, and if we work with it intelligently and we're willing to like go through that process with ourselves. But mostly we're kind of terrified, of ourselves and terrified of our demons, terrified of our darkness, terrified of what's going to come up, terrified of what will happen if I'm fully revealed to myself, and and what will others think of me, and so on and so forth. And the yoga is meant to help us come to terms with those fears so that we can have a deep, intimate relationship with, our deeper selves, with that sort of wellspring of creative energy that, that eventually expresses itself as our minds. And so a yoga teacher, a good yoga teacher would be someone, who's developed some rapport, with that sort of deeper spring of creative energy in themselves. And, and having, and being steeped in that process can also sort of, help other people to find that same kind of receptivity. And then to show them, of course, what do these practices have to do with all that? How do you use these practices in an intelligent way to bring that off? Yeah.
Then it's a lot about giving space,
knowing exactly,
context.
Knowing exactly where, according to, the current year in Mysore, whether you put your hand like this or like this or that pose. I mean, it's like, it has nothing to do with it. Precision is very, very important, but it's precision of responsiveness, precision of like, how am I holding my body as I'm breathing? Precision in feeling, and precision in the way that I'm moving to create this sort of cycling of prana that sort of so that I'm continuously inviting that cathartic release.
All right, Ty. Well, it's been a fantastic chat with you, and I'm going to ask you now, just to wrap it up, where do you see yourself in say 10 years time? What what do you what's your aspirations? What do you want to be doing? And what, and I suppose let me know what you're currently doing as well.
Yeah, well, I do know this, that if I reflect back, and I'm kind of creeping near 50 now, that there's never been any point in my life where where if you had asked me where I would have been 10 years ago, that it would have had anything remotely resembling where I was in that moment. So so that's why I kind of laugh about, where I'll be in 10 years. I mean, I really don't know. But, I have 2 young children. They're 7 and 4, and I spend more and more time with them. They're homeschooled, and so my wife and I are teaching them, and so certainly, that will be a huge part of my life for the next, I don't know, 10 to 15 years.
Oh, they're going to be some pretty smart children as well. Probably pretty good at yoga mythology as well.
Wild. They're
they're
very
going to hear
wild.
all that. They're going to, right? Yeah. Wow. Okay.
Not so very good at following patterns.
Yeah.
But very good at self-expression. But I've never been more inspired than I am right now to teach yoga and to experiment. With kind of, I don't know, still working from the Ashtanga system, of course, because that's where my roots are. And I think like for me, it's always important to to stay connected to my roots, but also to share the intelligence of what has been revealing itself to me in the last several years through practice. So yeah, I'm excited about all that.
Advice for younger self?
Advice for my younger self.
Yeah. It's always a good one. Yeah. I've got loads of these questions. I'll just throw out a couple. Yeah.
Advice for my younger self. Just trust.
So we always put in the notes where and what you're doing, but what are you currently doing that people can kind of come to or come find you on? Anything coming up that's of interest?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so I have a lot of intensives coming up, especially in Europe, but also so I've got something in India, a month-long intensive at Purple Valley from mid-January to mid-February. A number of other shorter workshops in Europe, also a month-long teacher's enhancement course in Sintra, Portugal in midsummer. And another, also a 2-week intensive in Boulder in late summer. And a bunch of shorter workshops and retreats scattered around.
Oh, that's fantastic. The longer term intensive periods will be fantastic with people, especially with the depth of information you're discussing here. It's not something that you can really convey, and it's certainly not on a podcast, but not even in a weekend workshop. So that's nice to hear. And yeah, I envy anyone that's able to spend that time with you. Well,
thank you,
and
Adam.
take this time to say thanks again for coming on. It's been a wonderful time with you. We'll put in the notes where you can find time, links to his stuff. Yeah, I'm sure everyone will really appreciate listening to us. And yeah, thank you for making that time and speaking so eloquently on such a complicated matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you.